basically a web page that takes the average of all the reviews around and says, you know, here's what we reviewed. Metacritic reviews are out of 100. And so what we find is that, you know, the Pitchfork review is down here. The Metacritic review is over here. And so what's the correlation between these two? And what you see is there's really no big difference between the ones that have best new music, don't have best new music, and the Metacritic scores. They're really quite, you can't tell anything different between these. Okay, so summary. Best new music basically has a very large effect. We think part of it has to do with the fact that there is something about playlists and other observables, but we'd like to nail it down. How could we nail that down? By basically getting information about the listens to the album before it gets reviewed, and then looking at it afterwards. Unfortunately, it's not clear how easy that is to get, because you'd have to be downloading data about all sorts of albums in the hope that Pitchfork might review some of them. Because what we want to know is Pitchfork reviewing them and giving best new music to the ones that already seem to be gaining some traction? We've already heard about some analytics that the record labels are doing, and you know, this could be something interesting. So we really want to understand where the channel is here. And that's it. Great, thank you.
You do have that question? Yes. No, I can't see.
Sorry.
Yes.
I've got two quick ones.
Yes.
One, you talk about taking as like a measurement anything on live performances, that if they get a higher review, are they more likely to play more shows that year or more likely to be added to Coachella? I'd be interested to see how these reviews not only affect plays, but live performances.
Yeah, so we haven't looked at that yet, but that's an interesting question to look at, and something we'll probably think about as we go forward.
And so my second question,
Yes.
so I know Pitchfork has a filtering like thing where you can only look at best new music or all of the reviews generally. So when you think about this mechanism, if you come up only on the DNM, there would be a number of users that only look at DNM rather than looking at all of the reviews. But I believe that feature was relatively recent. Could you look before they add just a DNM feature and see if that filtering mechanism leads to more people, like a greater effect than when they're embedded within all of their reviews?
That's a really interesting question. So we'd have to figure out exactly when that filtering happens. So that's a great point. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, Joel.
So, Chris gives your information a slightly different way. You have certain things that picture the probability of being the best new music is a score. When you think about those increments as sort of partial discontinuity of different sizes,
Yeah.
then you can just look directly at the sales figures, again, by increments. The point is, if you're below 80, it's purely just about the difference behind those scores. But once you get to the point where you have differences in the average propensity to be on best music, you have something you can compare with the difference in scores, which is more in the spirit of discontinuity. But there you go, the size of it.
But you're thinking about first differences for each one of those.
Well, let's talk about
Yeah, we'll talk about that offline, because I'm not sure that'll work, but because we have thought about it, we have looked at other discontinuities. Yes, Alan?
What is the process when we say choose best music? Is there a team? Is it voted? Do they have any information apart from the score that they actually do?
So that's a bit of a mystery to us. We've really tried to understand that better, and we can't find much in terms of what they say, who they talk to, and so it's really a mystery. Yeah.
I can tell you my limited experience with this course. We tried to enlist their support in the survey we did to musicians. So the head of our survey center tried to reach the founder I think it was free.
Okay,
No, but it didn't generate any, I was shocked that it didn't generate positions to fill out the questionnaire.
that's interesting.
But I do know that big was on the market. The other thing was Dan Ryan was on our project. Unfortunately, Amazon didn't allow him to participate in the program. Wasn't a band called The Loop, which was relatively successful. And they got a rating of like 7.8. And he really lamented that they weren't a bit higher.
Right, right. So, I mean, one thing, that, you know, you bring up some interesting points, and one thing that we have thought a little bit about is we've looked at, we're interested in looking at the effect that history has. So if I'm a band that's already had some success, some albums out, and they've done well, does a bad or good pitchfork review have much an effect? And so that's sort of another part of this that we're going to be interested in looking at.
Right? You could use the buzz data for that, and that has week by week streams.
That would be awesome. Okay, great. Thank you. Great.
Okay, thank you. Last but not least, Philip Cartwright about managerial influence in developing well-prepared artists.
Yeah, I'm not a Mac user either, so I'm not even close to this.
Definitely. Right.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I want to express my thanks on behalf of myself and my co-author, Aaron Williams at the Royal College of Music. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to participate in this program, and we do appreciate having the opportunity to present. I am an economist at the Paris School of Business, but more importantly for this particular work, I am the founder and CEO of a small management, marketing, and promotion company that works with emerging female artists in rock, alternative, and folk. Erin Williams is a professor of performance science and director of the Performance Science Center at the Royal College of Music. Academically, he's a psychologist. And Erin and I were actually put together by Noah Kejiyama at the Juilliard School. So it's kind of a strange but very rich marriage of minds, if you will, in doing this particular work. Erin and I started talking about some of the issues that we confronted, both in my case in practice with Horizon View, and in Erin's case, working in the world of conservatories. And one of the things that came out of our discussion was that we we really decided that, without being critical or negative, most of the textbook material which students are exposed to in the classroom when it comes to artist management, they're exposed to, of course, the phenomenal work of Passman. Alan has a textbook on artist management. At Berkeley, John Kellogg has a textbook that's used on artist management. And in my own experience in teaching at a sister school, an art school, we use similar texts. And those texts basically focus on management issues, marketing issues, finance issues, and business law issues. It is the case, in certainly my experience and in the experience of other managers that I know fairly well, there are a lot of other things that go on when you're managing an artist. And it's certainly true in the conservatory world as well. And based on Erin's experience, based on conversations we've had with some of the professors in the conservatory world, there are a lot of other touch points with, particularly in emerging artists. Now keep in mind we're talking about young emerging artists. They do not have teams. They have extremely limited resources. Some of them are still at the stage where they're playing for free, or basically for free, just to get the exposure. Now some of them get paid more as opening acts and so forth, but we're not talking about the kind of artists that can make a full-time living performing. It turns out in the conservatory world, just as an aside, it turns out in the conservatory world, many of the young artists lean on their one-to-one teachers for advice, for what is basically managerial advice, looking for opportunities. These one-to-one relationships lead to exposure to personal issues, personal lives, and these are the kinds of things that don't get discussed too often in the classroom, at least based on our experience. So this is a mashup of data I'm giving you. It's work in progress. It's a mashup of information. Erin has done a considerable amount of survey work with classical musicians. And in particular, a lot of the survey work that we relied on was focused on violin players and trumpet players. And the big reason for that is there are different physiological demands on those types of artists. The artists that I've talked to or worked with, both past clients, current clients, and perhaps future clients, most of them are guitar players, female guitar players, and vocalists. In a couple of cases, they're drummers. We lean very heavily on the literature, the business literature on coaching. And we find that one of the things that successful managers do is think through their responsibility as a coach and the different axes of requirements or relationships as between the manager-coach and the coachee. So we asked, I'm not going to go through all of these, but we certainly asked questions about, okay, what experience does Phil have as an artist manager? Am I qualified to manage this person? Is the young artist committed, involved? Are they willing to put in the effort? And I'll just, again, as an aside, for now with deference to Bach himself, we talk about the well-tempered artist, and some people have suggested that we should talk about the well-tempered manager. So we'll see what comes out of that. But again, thinking about the experience of the manager, the motivation and willingness on the part of the artist, what is the likely relationship with this person? Can you work together? Can you align your goals? Personally, I worked with artists for several months, and we just found that we had very different goals in mind, and it wasn't going to work. So these are all important things to think through, and certainly thinking through the coaching process and laying out a plan is extremely important. So what we've done is looked at much of Erin's survey work, and we tried to identify what I would call meta, I hesitate to call them skills, but the way the questions were asked, they did ask on the line of what skills do you have, where do you feel most competent, and where do you feel that you need the most support? And going through something on the order between 75 and 100 trumpet players and 75 to 100 violin players, we identified seven areas, and I basically have tried these out on just over 32, 33 rock and folk musicians. And they seem to work out pretty well as far as meta categories are concerned. And we asked questions about their lifestyle. How do you feel about your lifestyle? Do you put a high priority on health? How about your technical skills? Do you feel technically strong as a performing artist? Do you work well with other people? Can you work well in a group environment? How do you learn? How do you practice? How do you take what you do in practice to your performance, to the stage? How do you present yourself overall? And then issues related to career. And that's where, at least from our perspective, that's where the classroom experience is most finely developed with the standard, more or less the standard business curriculum. Now, clearly over time, depending on the artist and their age, their training, and relative maturity, the relative importance attached to each of these meta areas changes for sure. And it changes over time. And sometimes it can change over very short intervals of time. I just want to talk, I can't talk about all 7 dimensions today by any means, I'm not going to try, but I just want to pick up a few of them. And one of them is lifestyle. And this aligns very nicely with, Alan, some of the material that you presented yesterday in the survey. When we talked to artists, we found that professionals, that is, and in this case, professionals means artists that are being paid on basically a full-time basis. On the classical side, they're either with chamber or orchestral groups, and on the popular music side, they make at least 50% of their income performing popular music. It turns out that the professionals, the probability of having a serious accident is on the order of 60 to 75%. An accident related to performance. And the percentage is even higher among students. And one of the things that is particularly troubling is that students, if you're, I can certainly identify this in the popular world, students don't like to admit that they have an injury. Why? Because if you say, I can't play the gig tonight because my wrist hurts, well, chances are you're not going to be invited back to that venue anytime soon. So they'll play on and on and on with a severe injury. And it's true of classical music performers as well. Violin players, viola players, cello players frequently have very, very serious injuries with the neck and the shoulder. And it's important, our proposition here is that as a competent artist manager, you need to pay attention to these kinds of things because you're likely to wind up with an artist that is in serious, serious trouble with a disability and unable to play. Another thing that we have identified is that of the survey work that was done, 15% to 25% of the artists have or have had at some point in their career debilitating anxiety. And I mean by debilitating anxiety, it's so bad that they can't play. Instances of passing out before performances, vomiting on a frequent basis, that kind of thing. Again, this is something that we feel the artist manager has to focus upon in managing an artist. This is a hard to read slide, I know, but the point here is that if you look at mortality rates in popular music, the mortality rates are higher in this particular study than the general population to which it was compared. And you can see that, for example, in some genre, punk, rock, for example, deaths due to liver damage or violent deaths are more frequent than the general population. So these are things that play into the artist-manager relationship that might not be discussed widely in the classroom, but we found experientially and based on interviews and surveys to be very important. The practice area, and here, Aaron, this is an kind of your crummy practice room where you go in and play the piano for hours and hours. And you get used to that kind of an environment, and then you get thrown out into Symphony Hall. And what kind of adjustments are needed to get the artist from point A to point B? In the popular music world, in the world that I know better, we're in the garage one day and the next day we're at a festival in front of a screaming throng of fans. What kind of preparation is necessary for an artist to move from this isolated or insular environment to a much more public, much more exposed environment? It has to do with the risk. In the practice room, there's very little risk. Can you bring them into an environment where they can rehearse in bigger places with more people, develop rehearsal skills, so when they get out there to the big stage, the big performance, they're much better prepared, and we're not going to have to deal with some of these problems of anxiety or behaviors that are not attractive to an audience or do not engage in audiences. And Aaron actually has a simulator that he developed with Imperial College, where artists can go into the simulator and the wizard can manipulate the audience reaction. So if something goes terribly wrong, the audience can go, ah, or people start coughing, or there's a simulated jury, and after you hit about 3 notes on the piano, I actually did this, hit about 3 notes on the piano, and the chairman of the jury said, "Thank you, we've heard enough." And artists can become familiar with their response to those kinds of problems, so that when they get on the stage, they can engage an audience and be positive rather than feel as though they're confronting a camera. Another area that we look at is learning. How do students learn? Oftentimes, young emerging artists try to emulate the behavior of someone that they idolize. Hyphens, violin role. And the problem with that is, from a managerial point of view, and I found this to be true in, not a lot, but in some instances, in the artists that I've managed, they idolize or they try to emulate the behavior of a particular performing artist, and unfortunately they emulate, well, let's just say they try to emulate behavior that isn't particularly admirable. They pick up the wrong attributes. And there's no feedback from the emerging artist to the artist that they're idolizing. So it's important to pay attention to what the emerging artist is listening to, who they're emulating, their behaviors associated with those connections, so that they don't take on styles or attributes that could be detrimental to their career. Now, what I've done more recently, and I've done this with classical musicians and popular music musicians as well, we use these spider diagrams. And these are I'm just going to show you 2 of them, self-assessments. And this particular artist, female, she's 25, she's a rocker, she has 10 years of experience. And she basically ranked herself, shown by the orange line. She feels pretty comfortable with her lifestyle. She would like to develop her career and admittedly doesn't understand the intricacies of the kinds of things we've been discussing in this forum. Business law issues, copyright issues, how do you get onto a playlist? She doesn't really have a clue. So she admits to that. She feels her presentation is reasonably good. She practices on a regular basis, but recognizes she could improve. And she needs, and I agree with her completely, she needs a lot of work when it comes to working with other people and particularly accepting other people's ideas. So that's what this particular artist looks like. And from a managerial point of view, this helps me a lot because I know where she's coming from. And I can agree or disagree with her self-assessment, but it gives me some ideas as to where I need to put the most emphasis. Where do I need to work with her on a day in and day out basis relative to some of the other areas? This is an artist who is classically trained. She has 22 years of experience. She's 36 years old. She's a viola player, has played with major symphonies of the world. And she feels as though she is pretty well balanced, as you can see. Here again, career is an issue. She's actually I got to know her because she's actually branching out of the classical music world and doing chamber pop. So she has some ideas as to where she'd like to go with her career in the future. But you can see she's much better balanced, and in that sense, she's well-tempered relative to the younger artists that I showed you previously. So what we're going to do going forward, we're doing more and more of these self-assessment type interviews. I'll just say in concluding that we've basically said that while we acknowledge the extreme importance of learning management in the academic sense, learning management skills, learning about finance, learning about marketing, learning about accounting, and so forth, the manager's responsibility is much broader than those areas, and a holistic approach to management needs to be explicitly recognized and discussed. And understanding the artist ecosystem is essential to making that happen, and that's where our 7 meta characteristics or skills come into play. We find that particularly with very young emerging artists, it's important to communicate with them on a regular basis, understand their day in and day out activities. What are they doing for fun? Are they being constructive in their life? Are they building a constructive lifestyle? Or are they going down a road that is probably not going to support their success, at least in the music business? We also find that it's important to be in touch with the artist's aspirations and their goals, and help guide them in a way that's consistent with those aspirations or those goals. And if those aspirations or goals are unrealistic or off the beam relative to where we think they're likely to achieve the most success, we have to let them know that. And as a final note, I'll say that there's a big difference between trying to do this exercise with classically trained musicians out of the conservatory and some of the popular music artists that I've dealt with, particularly in rock. The conservatory-based artists are used to an academic environment. They're more structured. They're more agreeable when it comes to doing this kind of thing. I've had a relatively difficult time doing it with artists in popular music, particularly rock and folk. So, more to come.
We're a bit behind, but we might have time for a question. Okay.
Yes, so in the opera world, managers are not very well thought of in general. They're seen as being less knowledgeable about the genre than they used to be, and not to have the same interests as artists do. Okay, more short-term, more monetary, etc. So do you think that's a problem, this incentive compatibility issue really with managers? And if so, what can be done about it?
Well, no, I think that's a very good point, and that's one of the reasons why we got off on this tangent of being more of a holistic manager. In my case, in Aaron's case, he's an academic psychologist, and he works with young musicians, but he's also an accomplished trumpet player. So he does understand the artist's perspective. In my case, let's just say I try to play the piano and the guitar, but I've had my day performing as well. So I do have some understanding. I think that there is this issue of, and we've seen it happen, where I've seen it happen in the business school environment, where people that are academic accountants or strategy professors or what have you try to take on the role of an artist manager, and they don't have the right level of, they're not aware of this ecosystem. They don't have empathy for the artist as such. For them, it's more or less a book exercise. And it leads to the kind of situation that I think you're talking about.
But if a manager just wanted to maximize how much money they made,
Yes.
would they be doing everything that you say they should do?
It might not maximize the money. It might not maximize the money.
Yeah, that's a problem, right?
Yeah, but on the other hand, it might maximize the life expectancy.
Yeah.
Thank you for all this.